or afternoon, everyone. I hope you've been well. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today, we're going to give a very quick session in our event called Voices Unseen, Evidence Unheard, Reframing GBV Research for specifically migrant women. Let me introduce myself first. I'm Farah. I'm the MYCP Gender Research Lead. And today I'll be presenting with the amazing Roberta. She's with us right now. Roberta, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, sure. Hi, good morning, good afternoon. My name is Roberta. I am based in Germany and I'm the MyCP gender focal point. Very excited to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So today we're going to talk on two things more specifically, which is research and how research is trying to give voice to the voiceless per se, and also how this actually translate into advocacy spaces. Yeah, hopefully this will be a very, knowledgeable, interesting session for everyone. I will ask you one thing first before we even start, and that is why do you think women in general, or migrant women specifically, wouldn't report violence if violence happened to them? Why do you think they just not even like acknowledge that it exists? You can answer in the chat or you can raise your hand and go ahead. Anyone wants to go? Okay, there's someone in the chat. Abdurrahman says there are already in difficult situations. Okay, yes, I do agree. Anyone else? Okay, so you guys mentioned that, oh yeah. Sarah says lack of trust in institutions. That's a very, very common thing. Yes. Tripti says, firstly, they are scared and complaining, and it doesn't come easy. Yes, absolutely. Roberta says lack of information and access to help. Yes, absolutely. Tripti says when they are unaware of the system, the weaponization, when they are unaware of the system or like the health system as a whole. And Carolina says weaponization of migration status. I thank you so much for your answers. They are all very valid, and it will open our eyes into the next thing that we're going to talk about, which is when we see these low numbers of official reports. We said why they avoid reporting, but the consequences of not reporting in the first place, that will definitely translate into low numbers in official reports. So if you have low numbers already in reportings, that would create a knee-jerk reaction that would say, oh, then there isn't a problem. If there's no reporting, then there isn't a problem in the first place. But we have to ask ourselves, is the lack of data like really their fault, or is it a failure of the system as a whole? So gender-based violence, especially for migrant women, can still seem as underreported, and the lack of data is mostly because of what you guys mentioned, the lack of trust in the institution, the weaponization of migration status. So we found that the system itself is the one failing them. So I wanted to imagine if you were in a foreign country and perhaps even without papers, so your migration status is still like a very red flag, a very big red flag for the government there. The only person who can help you in that same place is the same authority in your head as a migrant. The same person who can help you is the same authority that could report you in any way or any time. So is it lack of data? No, it's mostly the system that is designed to make these people silent or avoiding help in the first place. So there is something called a power problem. Underreporting isn't really just an accident, it's a structural problem because it does have consequences if you report it. So some power problems which might be shocking is the data dependency. Most GBV data relies on formal reporting. So for example, if we had let's say a migrant woman. I'm a doctor, by the way, I forgot to mention that. But let's say a migrant woman had a clinic a visit, and she mentioned very briefly that she had been, violated at her home, or she doesn't feel safe anymore. If I, as a doctor, did not report that officially, then it didn't happen. And that's coming from someone who also does research on this part. Most GPV data doesn't really like come from the actual people themselves, and that's why we're going to talk about something called CPPR at the end on how to be part of the change. There's also the legal exclusion that irregular migration or not having the specific papers that they would need would also limit their access to the reporting system. So they might even know where to seek help, but their irregular migration or migration status will limit them to access these healthcare facilities or these help facilities as a whole. There's also institutional bias, and you guys mentioned that part, that systems mostly prioritize their citizens over migrants. Someone in the chat says, can we report their abuse without their consent, or is that an exception? Um, I would love to answer this question in next slides, not now, but I will let you know. Okay, one second. Okay, so there's also the political disincentives, and that is that the states in general underreport GPV as a whole, not just for migrant women, but also women as a whole. So that power problem is mostly rooted in the legal exclusion and the institutional bias that governments have against migrants as a whole. Okay. So what is traditional GPV research, and why does it fail? So most traditional researchers would be extractive. So you would have researchers go into communities and take the stories that they need, and they're like mining for gold, if you say so. Like they're trying to find the most shocking factor or like the most shocking story, and once they find that, they usually leave. And this ignores mostly the informal community or like the informal experiences of other migrant women that maybe didn't get the same, attention because their stories weren't as huge as they wanted them to be. So there's also the ignoring of informal community experiences. So if a woman talks to her neighbor, for example, or let's say a local religious leader in the church or in the mosque or anywhere really about their abuse, that is data. That is specifically data. So that's how you report. So you were asking Abdurrahman about how you report without their consent. If it's told you as a person, not just, let's say, you're not a doctor, you're not like someone in charge of the place that you're in. If someone did tell you about abuse that they were facing, you would have to take their consent before reporting. Yes, absolutely. But at the same time, there is like you don't have to go to the police stations. There is like some levels that you would have to go by. So for example, I'll tell you about CPPR at the end. Let's not like get into that right now. But what we're failing to capture here in the traditional GPV research as a whole is that we don't really see the reality of what's happening, and we become too obsessed with the formal part of it on how to make it like publishable, if that makes sense. Okay. If you guys have any questions or any points you want to make, please do raise your hand or just open your mic and go ahead. Okay, so now we'll see like some numbers. These are real numbers from different studies. Um, so we have that 50 to 80% of migrant, this is specifically to migrant women, lack legal protection pathways. So that's the legal part as a whole. So not just protection in the mental status, but the physical status, the healthcare status, the gender-based violence status. So legal protection as a whole. There's also 60%, which is mostly a cultural stigma that believe gender-based violence should remain a private family matter. And I believe most of us have heard that before, that if a woman feels like she's being abused, especially at home, she should just try to like be secret about it and try to like navigate it secretly without anyone knowing, because if people know, they would hold it against her in the first place. And lastly, less than 10% or equal 10% globally report to the police, which is a very, very low number, given the fact that like most of them have gone through gender-based violence. So reporting here does make a difference, because if there is like a reporting mechanism that is very, open and not really like racist against anyone, that would make migrant women, not just migrant women, honestly, just women as a whole, seek this sort of help without stigma around them. So silence in this case, unfortunately, is their safe choice to avoid like the violence being spread and the stigma around it. So that's really just the reality of migrant women in numbers. And of course, you would think that you were just saying the statistics really like aren't representing the real cases, and I do agree. I'm pretty sure these statistics have not researched enough about what is actually happening. But these are just the papers that I found. Okay, so now on to the most important part of the session, I feel, which is like the hidden forms of violence and how you don't really see them, but at the same time, you don't know how to actually like implement your help in it. So we need to talk about the violence that isn't really on the news that much. There is the marital rape, sexual exploitation or trafficking, survival sex, and trafficking. So, in my research with MYCP, I've written about survival sex of Venezuelan women migrating in Colombia and how the instances of survival sex have risen, where women try to trade their bodies for a place to sleep or even just a safe pathway from other people who would try to exploit her. But what I'll more, focus on is marital rape. Have you guys heard of marital rape before, or have you like seen cases of it before? I know it's pretty new, but for example, in my area or in my region, it's not really a thing because religiously it doesn't exist. Not really true, but have you guys heard of it recently? And if you have, where have you heard of it?
Hi, I'm Tripti. Can I speak?
Yes, we can hear you, Tripti.
Okay, so I haven't heard marital. By the way, I come from India, and the term marital rape is not very prominent because, as you said, most of the women they don't tend to speak about their private matters in public. So we don't get to hear about marital rapes. But recently, I watched a movie which was based on marital rape and how the lady emphasizes, like, without consent even after marriage, it is considered marital rape. So yeah, that's how I got to know about it.
Thank you so much, Tripti. You have to share the name of the movie with us, please.
Oh, sure,
Okay,
sure.
Shika, please go
Lovely.
ahead. Thank you, Tripti. Please go ahead, Shika.
Oh, thank you so much. So this is actually a topic I've also been, focused on for a long time. And I'm from Portugal, and recently the European Union actually changed the laws of rape, for example, because our previous law was no is no. It means that if someone at some point, no matter the relationship it had with the other person, said no, from that point on, it would be considered rape. But now we changed the law. I don't know if it's going, to be applied in our state members, but the new law is if it's not a yes, it's a no. It means if there's not explicit consent, then it's not consent and it's rape. And unfortunately, what we've been seeing in Europe, especially with things like the red pill movement. There's even like this series on Netflix that are, causing a lot of uproar because there's been kind of this evaluation, like this evolution backwards in the sense like I think women right now, even in Europe, are in a more fragile position because you can see a lot of men, especially younger men, committing this against their, peers. Unfortunately, we see things like this every day in the news. There is this mentality that as soon as you marry someone, they become your property, so they have no say in if they're going to give consent or not. So I think this issue is becoming more worrying, at least in my context, and it's something that I believe we don't speak enough.
Thank you so much, Shika. And I do agree that the law really isn't on the women's side with this one. Yashiba, go ahead, please.
Kind of adding on to what Francesca and Tupti were saying, because I'm also from India. Actually, here the conversation on marital rape is very restricted because the judiciary doesn't recognize it as a crime. So while India, for example, has really on paper has very strong legislation on rape, but it does not have any legislation. It refuses to recognize marital rape as a crime because legislation, and I think that's the biggest challenge, like when legislation tries to co-opt to societal values based on religion and other cultural like norms, that's when gender-based violence becomes even more of a risk, and like how it's being perceived becomes more as a risk, because the justification for not recognizing marital rape in India is that marriage is a sanctimonious contract between two individuals, and if that ends up getting policed by the court, they think that kind of in like really infringes on like people, not just, it's not coming from a cultural point, it also comes like from a social, cultural slash religious point of view as well. So I think there's a real risk when judiciary and legislation kind of co-opts that narrative, because that really takes away from survivors. And the movie that Trupti just talked about kind of is touching on that as well. But then even after, you know, that conversation was brought up in mainstream media, there's been actually a lot of backlash from people because they think that speaking about this and just kind of getting that as a real concern is something that can really threaten Indian values or societal values, which is again something that I feel stands as like barriers for women that are trying to access help, and especially when it comes to marital rape.
Thank you so much, Yashiba. And I do agree on the part where you mentioned that
Oh,
I'm
I
sorry,
think we've lost
I keep
Farah.
leaving, sorry. Yes, I'm here. I was saying thank you, Yashiba, and touching upon the point where even when people like saw it in real life and saw it in a show, even they still thought that that wasn't true enough. And there was there was something in the chat I was reading. Abdurrahman says, I heard about it on Facebook where the person was disputing it, saying the wife belonged to the husband, so he couldn't actually rape her. He kept mentioning meher as if that justifies it. So meher in the EMR, or like the Eastern Mediterranean region, or I believe it's only in the Middle East actually. Meher is like in our religious beliefs is what a man has to give for to the woman um, when he marries her. It is an obligation, but since it's an obligation in our religion, men think that that's how I'm buying my wife, which is not really true. And even our prophet, peace be upon him, did not mention that at all. But men these days do try to justify that, yeah, I've bought her, or I've given so much money and so much effort, I should be able to at least take that from her. If I lag one more time, I'll switch my internet, I promise. But yeah, I was saying, no, like even then, men believe that in their heads, even if their religion doesn't say so, in their heads, they're still like some sort of property that they own. So yeah, that's Meher. And Sarah says, yes, in Colombia, it has appeared in public debate and media coverage, particularly around clarifying that sexual consent is required in all relationships, including within marriage, and that marriage does not imply automatic or permanent consent. Yes, absolutely. I'm very glad that most of you, or all of you, actually know what that is, because we're gonna talk more about it right now. So let me introduce what the research is about first. Marital rape research, a case of systematic erasure. So I'll give you the idea. Can you guys see me? Can you guys hear me? Just give me a thumbs
Yes.
up. Okay, perfect. Because I switched my internet connection. Okay. Okay, so I apologize severely for my internet connection. That's a common thing in Egypt.
No, we can see you
I don't
now.
think I've mentioned that, but I'm from Egypt, and anyone who's from Egypt would understand what I'm saying. It's very, very, very annoying. But yeah, either way, I was um Tripti can really Tripti is in Egypt as well. Yeah, she's a friend. Okay, I'll try one last time. If it doesn't work, I'll have to close my camera, guys. Okay. So let me give you the idea uh, behind what I was saying. So we mentioned marital rape, but I didn't mention marital rape just because if it was like trendy or something that is completely new. It wasn't new to me because in 2022, like towards the end of 2022, starting 2023 until 2024, I was the leader in a research that was on marital rape. It was considered a very, very, very new subject, and even our supervisor she wasn't against it, but she was very hesitant to support it because it was a whole new thing. They did do cases and research about rape as a whole, but marital rape was just a very new subject. So from 2022 to 2024, we looked specifically in marital rape in our hospital, and we had a questionnaire. We made this questionnaire, we validated it, and we started asking questions to the patients there in the hospital where I work. So we would think that most people knew what merited rape is or at least heard of it, but most of them didn't. Our first aim, or like the main aim of our research, was to know if there is even any rape in the first place, or merited rape, the prevalence as a whole. We found that the prevalence was 39%, 35% among, I think, 200 responses, which is a huge, huge number. Then we did ask if they had known or heard of something called marital rape in the first place, and about 69% did not know what this was. By the way, our questions were directed to married women, like actual married women who know what this is, but 69% did not hear of something called marital rape. We also had a specific criteria that if they met 3 or 4 out of these criterias, then they have been raped, even if they did mention at the end that, no, I don't think he has done anything bad to me, or I don't think I've been raped before. Even if they thought that, this criteria would 100% say that, no, they have been raped, but they don't know it yet. So we did ask, one of these criteria questions was coercion into sex. Have he tried to like not push you just physically, but like mentally? Did he use religion against you? Did he use like social pressure against you? Did he use like financial methods against you? And 81%, which is like most of them, have said yes, he did try to coerce me into sex many times. And I'm pretty sure there were other options that they weren't mentioned, but the coercion methods, and this might be a shocker, the coercion methods were a lot, but the most prominent one and the one with the highest number was religious weaponization. So what this man would do in my country, our religion is very important to us. But what these men would do is they would take this sort of, religious guilt and push it against their wives into the form that God would not love you if you did that. The angels will hate you if you don't sleep with me. And they would just put it out in the most gaslighting way possible, and it would kind of work. That mentioned by the patients. So we did think that if they had been raped before, maybe they were also facing IPV, which is intimate partner violence. And yes, that was right. 74% out of the 81% faced intimate partner violence. And it's not just physical, it's also mental. So it does make sense that these two are high. So lastly, we did try that maybe they seeked help, and it didn't have to be like professional formal help. We did mention, did you guys seek help from your family members or from your mother, from anyone that's close to you, a friend, anyone, literally, just help, any sort of help. And about 54% did not at all seek help in the first place. When we asked why you didn't seek help, they mentioned that they had this social stigma against it in the first place, and they thought that they should just like fix it within their family home, or like within their husband. It doesn't have to be like a whole thing where they would have to seek help, because they didn't think that it was huge. They thought it was just like a family dispute or like a marital dispute. They believed that sex in general in their marriage is a marital duty that they would have to do in the first place. So that's why they didn't seek help in the first place, because they didn't make it out to be this huge thing that they would need to like step up for. And lastly, we asked a very controversial question, because we thought that we would get a better number on that question, that who did they blame in this issue. Most of them, fortunately, did blame the guy who was doing the coercion, but about 24% of them mentioned that they blamed the victim because of the religious guilt. So mostly the older women that we asked were blaming the victim or blaming the woman, because they thought that this marital duty is so important that if you don't do it, you're just like just ruining the marriage in the first place. So that shows that women were simply systematically disqualified, not just from their own family, but from the society as a whole, that if you mention any sort of marital dispute that you had with your husband, even if it's in the form of this huge thing like rape, you're still not being like realistic, and you're not the victim. You're actually the one who's trying to ruin the marriage in the first place. So this is genuinely just, it was a whole like year and a half, 18 month review and research. And I wanted to share the percentages with you guys, because we did face a lot of problems trying to present this research. And a lot of women were with it, but a lot of men and against it were against it. And it wasn't really published at the end of the day because of that. So our key findings was that the underreporting itself was due to marital and societal norms. So that it was from elderly family members, or it was from family as a whole. It wasn't really from friends. And there was the lack of legal recognition of marital rape as rape in the first place. It wasn't considered that at all. It was considered a family dispute. Internalized stigma, as I mentioned, the older women did feel like they were not supposed to talk about these things, because they felt like they didn't really care for it that much, and women, the next generation of women, should be the same. So that made them like have an internalized sort of stigma. And also the health and psychological consequences of what it had. A lot of women did bring like a lot of STIs when they came to the clinics, and they brought with them a lot of mental challenges as well. So yeah, it was really hard to see at the time. So at the end of the day, women were not just unheard. This like silence had other consequences, that they were systematically qualified from being heard in the first place. So this is like the end of my research on how it happened and the marital rape as a whole. If you guys have any questions or any points you want to make, please do go ahead. But speaking on the research part, let's continue on why traditional research fails migrant women. So why was my research, I would consider that I didn't really like do that much for them afterwards, because I was systematically disqualified, literally. So we have 3 points that I want to touch upon, and that is that ethics doesn't really equal safety. So yes, we did get the ethical approval from the hospital, and we did like actually like have it all ahead of us. It was very professional, very formal, but at the end of the day, didn't really eliminate any of the risks that they had, and it wasn't really like made for them to be helpful. You know, participation of these women as well can expose migrant women to some sort of retaliation or legal consequences, because these women are here under the idea that they would not be protected all the time. So why would they push themselves to be in a research that would expose their information? So that was like a problem that we faced, that most migrant women in Egypt, they're mostly Sudanese women. Most migrant women there, or Sudanese women, were not they didn't really give us consent to do the research. So yeah, most of our percentages and most of our statistics were from Egyptian women. Data collection also does not equal justice. So after what we did, most researchers in general just stops at publication, and there's no guaranteed like legal follow-up or help in the first place. And that's what we tried not to do. But after we presented our case and after we presented our research, we were faced with so much like hate and just like no, in the like no, you're not gonna continue with that. Maybe because it was like 4 years ago, but at the same time, I felt like this was disqualifying what all women went through, not just my data, but what everyone else was going through, and what I was simply like just a source for to voice out their problems. And lastly, but that's not in our case, but in general, consent doesn't always equal this protection. Informed consent that give you, or like that does give the migrant women the full understanding of the consequences. But the reality is that there is still a power imbalance when you're trying to navigate this research with migrants, that they would also depend on their employer or spouse. For example, why did Sudanese women did not really want to include themselves in our research was because their spouses were with them and they did not want them to do that. So yeah, there was just limited space and limited freedom as a whole. IOM says that migrant participation is often shaped by coercive or constrained environments, and that's exactly what we had found out through our research. And GBV research often documents violence without improving access to justice in general, and that's what also we faced. So now that we have faced the problem and the consequences of it all, how should we reframe research? So how do we fix it? How do we move from like just on paper to actual like advocacy or in real life help? So we need to move from extractive research to participatory research, and that's what we'll talk about in a minute. We also should stop treating women as subjects and try to treat them as experts and make them make the research more community-led, not really institutionalized. And at the end of the day, we have to move this data into an evidence for justice, and Roberta will be talking more about this point. So really quickly, let me mention something called a community-based participatory research approach. And that is like, how do you translate these studies and this statistics into designing and conducting it with the people themselves? So you can reuse this research and co-create it with the people that are actually involved in the research. For example, if I wanted to make my research again, I would have loved to like include marital rape victims into the research questions and into the decision making after the research. But that wasn't the case. Unfortunately, I was a student at the time. And also their lived experiences is very, very valid. And you would not need like any academic part to be part of CPPR. You would be the one responsible for it. But at the end of the day, your data will come from the actual people that are involved in this problem. The WHO says and recommends CPPR for sensitive topics like GBV because it does improve the idea on how to navigate solutions for GBV in the first place from people who actually faced it. And NIH, which is the National Institution of Health, says that it relies or gives out more relevant intervention based on what the need is from the GBV survivors and a better long-term impact as a whole. So it's like I like this the story of like a man that would go and make cosmetics based on his idea of how to make cosmetics without like taking the the decision or any sort of idea behind what cosmetics is for or who is it for. I believe you guys know a lot of examples like that of which women should be the one, like for example, the research in general on human body were mostly done for men and by men. It wasn't really like made on women's bodies, and that's why a lot of our vaccines and like hospital institutions as a whole, they were really just designed for the male body, not just the female, not involving the female body as a whole. So real impact pathways, that's where we give you like the freedom to try to like add this research data or these statistics and not just, give it to your own community, but translate it into something bigger. Maybe you could translate it into policy influence. And I believe Yashiba could give us more on that, like translating it into policy briefs or UN submissions. You could also translate your research or your data into advocacy power. And that's what we did here on International Women's Day. We tried to like have a huge campaign of many like speakers with multiple experiences, and that strengthened our idea in the first place. We also had a blog and we had a lot of other things. And lastly, that is for you guys, is that youth-led research is disruptive, and what we should do going forward is to try to challenge the hierarchies of who is responsible to speak about who, if you get what I mean. Like, migrant women should be more involved in what is written about them and how their truth should come out to the world. Okay, so that is just a very, very quick like ethical framework. It's the lives model. This is for the gender-based violence survivors upon first contact. It doesn't have to be healthcare system, but I just wanted to mention this part since you probably have known or have seen a gender-based survivor before, gender-based violence survivor before. So this first line support is very important, and we do teach it at the hospital. It's the lives model. We teach it in Arabic, but it's the lives model. The L is for listen, to listen closely with empathy. I is for inquire about their needs and concerns. Validate what they're going through. Enhance their safety by discussing a plan to protect themselves moving forward, and as support, help them contact information. How we did the lives model in my research, it was through listening, inquiring, validating was through our questionnaire. Enhancing their safety was giving them out the numbers for people who could help, NGOs, governmental organizations, and we tried to support them as much as we could. So yeah, I think this lives model could give you a very nice idea on how to move forward next time you see a gender-based violence survivor. Okay, so now I'll leave you to the part where how we can take this evidence beyond research, and Roberta will take it from here. Thank you so much. If you guys have any questions, do write it in the chat.
Thank you so much, Farah. This was super interesting. I took some notes so that I can connect it a little bit more concretely to what I have prepared, and also connect it a bit to the comments. But I'll try to be a bit concise so we have time for a discussion, because I can see there's a lot of interest by everyone attending. So when we look at research, I think the aim that we all have in doing our research is to then improve the situation of the people that we work with. So the question is always, how do we translate the research or the data that we have collected into justice for the people that we want to empower? So I would always frame it as, we have our findings and we translate them into evidence and then into justice. And that's, of course, always a little bit dependent on the context that we're in, the legal policy, and also accountability spaces in different countries and regions can be quite different. But I'll still try to do it a little bit broad. So the main point that we always have is making our research usable. And there's something called a translation chain that we can use for this, which I would kind of put into 3 different steps. So the first step that we have is we have our findings, and we need to be able to translate them into legal evidence. And preferably, it would be legal standards that we already have, which can be easier or harder depending on the case that we're trying to work on. But the important part is that research must be framed in a way that can meet legal standards and not just academic ones. And sometimes we can do this by linking it to other rights violations that can happen in the case. This is something I wrote down as a note. So, for example, in a lot of places today, marital rape is not a crime. But, for example, violence against a person would be a crime, right? So there's sometimes already legal systems that we can make use of to fight an issue before we go into the advocacy of changing laws. So it's a matter of being able to translate what we're experiencing into the systems that we live in. Another part is going from evidence to advocacy tools. So this is especially when we want to move legal frameworks. So that's it means that we need to be able to translate our findings into policy briefs, into clear recommendations, in clear asks tied to legal obligations. And honestly, this is something I think that youth or women-led groups are already particularly strong at, I think, because they're able to turn lived experience into narrative and into data, which sometimes makes it a little bit more politically compelling. And also, without us shaping these narratives, it's very, very hard for us to be visible to decision-making spaces. And then the third part of the translation is then moving from advocacy to access to justice. So the goal is not just policy change in itself, but it's also to create safer pathways for reporting. It's to access services regardless of the status, specifically when we think about migrant women, and then also having accountability mechanisms. So our final objective is that evidence must change what survivors can actually access. And I think what makes youth or women-led research particularly effective in that is that, for one, it normally is trusted data. I think we specifically look into our communities when we do our reporting. And there's also a lot of hidden evidence that is not really captured in formal systems, as Farah has already outlined in her example. And this kind of perspective is very, very important for demonstrating systematic exclusion that we have in society, and that we're not talking about isolated incidents. And it's also very much about strengthening both legal arguments, but also policy reform. And I think for today, I brought one example that is quite interesting. That's also in the field of gender-based violence, that I think is a good example of where research led to systematic or legal change. And I brought this example from Australia called the Aspire project. Aspire stands for Analyzing Safety and Place in Immigrant and Refugee Experience. And it was a major research initiative in Australia from 2015 to 2016 that focused on the experience of gender-based violence by migrant and refugee women. And it was led by several universities in Australia with the main focus of 3 questions. So what they wanted to explore is, what are immigrant and refugee women's experiences of family violence and of help seeking in selected geographic communities in Australia? And then they looked at what the local barriers were for the migrant women, especially in the facilitation process, but also in the violence prevention and then in the support services. And the third question that they had is, what opportunities exist for supporting community-led responses to family violence against immigrant or refugee women? And basically, the key findings identified some of the main challenges that migrant women face in this context. So those were some of the ones that you also mentioned in the chat earlier. So it was visa dependency. Sometimes perpetrators used threats of deportation or immigration status to control victims, which of course made them very dependent on them. Then a lack of cultural competence. So a lot of migrant or refugee women were not aware of the standard services. And those services also often fail to provide culturally appropriate or accessible support to these women. Then there was also the factor of isolation, especially for migrant women, facing isolation from community, but also financial abuse or a lack of understanding of their own legal rights. And the conclusion was that there needed to be community-led approaches that very much targeted the needs of migrant and refugee women. And the interesting factor here was that this research started as a research, but it led towards significant policy change in Australia because it directly informed the national plan to end violence against women and children. And that was in 2022. So we already have quite a gap from when the research happened in 2016 to when the policy happened. But this data that this research produced became part of this national action plan, and it did set legal and strategic frameworks on a federal level in Australia. And for example, what this included was the inclusion of cultural competencies in help centers. So the data provided evidence ensuring that cultural competency is not just a buzzword, but it's something that women need to be able to access crisis centers. And then another part was a focus on structural barriers. So the national plan incorporated findings regarding the visa restrictions and economic insecurities that migrant women face. And it also was able to address some of the more cultural contexts. So, for example, the issue of dowries, like what you just said earlier with the Mer in Egypt or in most Muslim countries, but of course exists also in other religious groups in different capacities, which culturally did not really exist in Australia. So there was no legal frameworks or an understanding by the crisis centers regarding what dowry means and why some women might feel pressured in that context to stay in relationships or to not speak out. And then they also addressed migration law. So they had clear recommendations regarding family violence provisions by widening visa types and ensuring that women are not forced to stay in abusive relationships due to their insecure immigration status. And then they also had a stronger emphasis on interpretation services, so language-wise, for women to be able to access these points. So this is like a quite clear example where research directly was able to then link to policy change. And I put up, like, noted down some steps that are relevant and I think transferable to different contexts. So for one, when we start with our research, I think an important question that we have to ask ourselves is, what legal or policy process will my research be able to inform? And then the next step would be to understand the policy cycles in the context or country that you're in. And a big part is also bilingual language. And with bilingual language, I mean that sometimes in academia or in research, we have terminologies that are very clear to us that are not clear to people that are not in the space. So it is very much a skill to be able to translate your research findings into something that is tangible for someone who's not in the space. And then the next step is also to just build alliances early. So to find other researchers, legal experts, or policymakers that are in your space that can support your messaging. And then another step is finding your window of opportunity, I would say. So that could be, there's an upcoming legislation. Is there a bill that's currently being debated that in some way relates to your work where you can insert your findings into? It could be current events. So is there something on the news, a story that is highly relevant that connects to what you're saying? Is there currently on the news a case of gender-based violence that went viral? Because sometimes we need these kind of high points in people's recognition of the issue to then come with evidence and show this is not a one-person issue, this is a wider societal problem. Another way we could do it is budget cycles. So when do specific political departments actually decide where they're going to spend their money? And then another part is finding out who to talk to. So this could be in some countries legislative assistance. So sometimes it's not the right thing to write a letter to your minister or to your mayor. Sometimes it's their assistant who will actually read the things that you send. Sometimes it makes more sense to reach out to think tanks or to NGOs who have maybe already an ear of the government and can champion your findings. And sometimes it could be a civil servant working in a certain position. And then the next step would be to really build a narrative around this. So we have our data findings and we need to connect them to a compelling case, have concrete numbers that we can showcase that people can listen to. And then in the long run, what is of course important for us, and I think this was also already outlined by Farah, is that we need to stay ethical in our documentation processes so that our research can remain participatory for people that are affected by it, and so that it can be accepted into legal or policy spaces and can also be scaled to other contexts. And then for us to keep feedback loops with the people that we're trying to empower if we're not the person affected by the issue that we're trying to address. And then in the long run, of course, the goal would always be to scale or to replicate. So something that makes sense maybe on your specific hospital level could then be transferred into a neighborhood or into Cairo as a whole, or maybe Egypt or the region. So it always makes sense to look into wider peer-to-peer data collection, the integration of research into advocacy, and then policy engagement. And when we want to scale, we have to also think about, is there a way for us to have long-term investment into our research? Is there institutional recognition of our participatory evidence? And also, are there platforms that we can connect to? And that could be both local or on a global space, of course. So then to kind of summarize what I was saying is that the challenge for us is not only to generate more evidence, because a lot of the time we have the data on a smaller scale, but then it's very difficult for us to have it travel into the spaces that it needs to be in for it to allow for change. So that's why I noted down that we need to go from community to courts, from lived experience to policy reform, and then from data to justice, so that we can actually have the impact on the communities that we want to positively impact. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Roberta. And that will be it for our session. And thank you so much, guys, for like being present. And honestly, I feel like this was really, really like informative. Even on my part, I learned a lot from what you just said, Roberta. So if you guys have any questions, please do drop them in the chat or raise your hand. And just it could be any question, or it could be like what you learned today, or like what we could do moving forward, or if you have like a subject that you guys wanted us to talk more about. Abdurrahman says, could you tell us about reporting GPV as a doctor? Okay, first of all, um, that would be like a totally different session. And since most people here are not doctors, I would suggest that you text me and I'll let you know how to do it in the context of a hospital. So you do have my email. My email is at the end, or if you could um like text me on Instagram also, I'm free. Sarah says, thank you all for your great insights. Could you please elaborate on the role of youth research and share some tips on how to get started? Also, Farah, I would love to hear more about your research on Venezuelan women in Colombia. Thank you so much, Sarah. So my research on Venezuelan women in Colombia was posted on MYCP reports. They can find it. You can find it in like just search MYCP. You can find it in the website itself. It's under the gender part. There is a human trafficking part, health part, and a gender part. That would be mine. And it was researching the lack of SRHR for migrant Venezuelan women throughout migrating towards Colombia. But it did have like the problem, how they dealt with it, the consequences, and what they're actually doing right now. So it was pretty interesting on what I found. And also the lack of documentation, or the lack of help, or the lack of SRHR as a whole, or SRH services as a whole, was mostly due to what we mentioned today, which is not lack of data, but it was more lack of like feeling like you would get your justice, or feeling that the institution actually cares for you. So it was pretty interesting. Um, Renat says she would love to be involved. You can subscribe to MYCP newsletter, and that's where you can find like more information and more events like this one. Does anyone else wanna like ask anything? You could share like an idea. Tripti says it was really informative knowing about marital rape and GPV, and coming from another culture, saying something affects places and people regardless of the culture. This was a wonderful and inspection. Definitely gave me lots of things I want to do my homework about. And thank you, Farah and Roberta. Thank you so much, Tripti. And we love to have you here. Okay, since we have finished, if you guys don't mind, we can take a picture. You could open your cameras, or it's okay. I understood what you were trying to say. If you could open your cameras, that would be great. If you could not, I'll just take the picture على طول. Okay, we'll wait for you guys. Hi, Tripti. Hi, Sarah. Yeshiva, are you gonna join us? Carolina, if you don't mind, could you take a screenshot with me as well, because I'm a little like technologically behind. I'm a grandpa when it comes to these kind of stuff.
I would be happy to.
Thank you.
Okay, I will do a countdown because I also am working with a new keyword.
Okay.
One moment, please.
Shika is here. Hi, Shika. Okay, Abdurrahman and Nuran, should we wait for you guys, or should we take the picture? Um, how would they access the recording and presentation, Yeshiba?
So we have the recording link, and when that's generated, I'll just send it across.
Okay, perfect. Okay, no one else is gonna join. Okay, let me get, okay. Are you guys ready?
Okay, let
One,
me.
yes,
Okay, yeah. Ready when you
one.
are.
Okay,
One, two, Oh my God. I'm so sorry. My screenshot tool is not working today. Okay, so 1, 2, 3.
Perfect.
Okay. Thank you all so much. And then I'll make sure to share this with the team as
Yeah.
well.
Perfect. Thank you guys so much for joining today. And if you need anything, you guys have my email, and also Roberta's email. We can also like send it. I think Yeshiba, you can send our email through like the follow-up email, right? If they need anything, they can
Yeah.
reach out. Perfect. Okay. Thank you guys so much. See you. Bye. Wait,